Hi, my name is Stephen Brookfield, and this is going to be a short explanation of the scholarly personal narrative method of writing a dissertation. The scholarly personal narrative was developed by Robert Nash at the University of Vermont, and he published a book in 2004 called Liberating Scholarly Writing. And in that book, he argued that we needed another form of dissertation alongside more traditional empirical case studies and other reports. We needed a dissertation that focused on narrative, on storytelling. So since 2004, he has written a number of books, and we'll talk about some of them in a little while. But each of those has fleshed out the methodology of a scholarly personal narrative, talked about different examples of it, given some instances in which students have written a scholarly personal narrative. And so in this presentation, I did want to start out by acknowledging Robert Nash's work. He is the founder of this methodology. I would say, though, he has had some very important collaborators along the way. Sidnee Viray has written several books along with him. DeMethra Bradley wrote a book we'll talk about, a very important book on methodology. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk first about what an SPN, that is a scholarly personal narrative, comprises. I will probably slip into using the verbiage of SPN quite a bit because that's a nice shorthand way of referring to it. Then I'm going to talk about how we generate a question that's going to be the focus of an SPN dissertation. I'm going to talk about how a dissertation proposal could be developed using the SPN methodology. I'll be referring to some frequently asked questions about the SPN method, and then I'll end up giving a little bit of advice on future resources. The basic idea of an SPN is that you begin with a wish to explore a central question. So just like any other dissertation, you need to have your question very clear at the outset. Two SPN dissertations that I myself have supervised have done this, so I thought I'd use them as examples. In the first dissertation by Sandra Unger, Unger, Sandra was interested in looking at the question of how do you build authentic, reciprocal, genuine relationships across lines of racial and class difference. So Sandra is a white woman who founded a program called The Lift in East St. Paul many years ago. And as part of her program, which was a community, non-profit, grassroots organization, she had to develop relationships with people of different racial identities and from different class backgrounds than her own. She moved into the suburbs to do this work. She is both pastor and also organizer of The Lift. So in her study, she reviewed her experiences of, well, what constitutes an authentic reciprocal relationship? What are the chief events and incidents along the way that I recall as being significant? What advice would I give to others in a situation similar to mine, trying to build authentic relationships across racial and class differences? The second dissertation, I'm going to use an example, is also one I supervised by Laura Love. Laura was interested in getting colleagues in predominantly white school systems in Wisconsin to open themselves up to uncovering and challenging racism within the system. She wanted to bring the concepts and practice of white supremacy to their attention. But predictably, she faced a lot of pushback and resistance. So her dissertation focused on the dynamic of dealing with resistance to potentially transformative work around race. She worked in professional development and used that as her context. So you can see that in both of these dissertations, a central dynamic is being explored. In the first, it's the dynamic of how do we build authentic relationships across racial and class divides. In the second, the dynamic explored is the dynamic of resistance. How do we respond to resistance from those whites who don't wish to participate in professional development activities around white identity, white supremacy, and white racism? The question is crucial because the question determines everything that follows. After the question has been decided upon, then you have to investigate the question by collecting and analysing data, just as you would in any other dissertation. But in an SPN, the data that you collect and analyse is the data of your own experience, your own story, your own life history, although, as we'll see, this is not a life history dissertation. It has some differences from that methodology. But unlike most qualitatively inclined dissertations where you go out and interview people, transcribe the interviews, collect field notes, and then you interpret all that data and make some observations and generalizations and so on, an SPN doesn't do that. All you do is review your own life events. So the data is your own personal experience. Then you have to analyze this data just as you would in a normal dissertation. In an SPN, the data analysis is done partly by looking for themes that keep recurring, so it is coded in that sense like any other qualitative data set. But you also analyze your data by looking at it through the lens of research and theory and relevant literature. So the data analysis is done by contrasting what it is that you're uncovering in your own personal experience with whatever relevant research, literature, and theory says about it. So throughout an SPN, you go back and forth. You describe a particular event, talk about its meaning for you, why you regard it as so crucial, and then you analyze that event through contrasting lenses of different kinds of theory and literature. Let me just give a quick example of this. In Sandra Unger's dissertation, looking at how we develop authentic relationships, she critiques her own observations. So when she feels like people of color trust her, she looks at the literature on, let's say, the black gaze on whiteness that a man called George Yancey has done some very productive work on. And she looks at her own white assessment that she has built an authentic relationship of trust through the lens of the black gaze on whiteness. Or maybe she looks at work on racial microaggressions by someone like Derald Wing Sue at Teachers College. And she looks at her data and says, well, do some of the things that I felt were authentic expressions of my friendship, did they contain some racial microaggressions? So in an SPN, as you're putting your data out there for readers, you're also analyzing it through the lens of research, theory, scholarly literature. This research sometimes challenges what you are coming up with in the way I've just described. Sometimes it illuminates and supports it, so maybe you recount a particular experience or set of events, and then you find literature which gives terminology, which names in a more scholarly way the events and the dynamic that you've just described. Sometimes the literature that you bring in and view your narrative through, sometimes that literature reinterprets the experience. So you give your initial interpretation of what you thought was happening, and then you say, but from lens A or through theory B, this experience could be interpreted in a different way. So a scholarly personal narrative is what those three words represent. It's scholarly because it's constantly referring to relevant literature, theory, and research in the field. So it's not just you telling your story. It's scholarly. It constantly brings in relevant literature. It's personal because it's your own personal experience that is the data set that's being examined. And while in an SPN you will maybe bring in conversations or talk about things that happened in the company of others, ultimately what you're doing is recounting your own personal take on those events and experience and those incidents. So it's really a recounting of your personal history. And then it's a narrative, the third term in an SPN. It's a narrative. So it's told as a story. You lay out the initial dynamic you want to explore. There is a beginning to the story around your initial efforts to understand what's going on. Then as you get into the narrative of your experience, you pinpoint significant turning points, high points, low points. You identify points of contradiction, moments when some kind of dissonance was put in front of you and you now had to account for that. And then you end up, as you would in a story, with some kind of conclusion, which is essentially the implications and the generalizations for others that you draw from your own experience. So the dissertation has a narrative arc to it. It's told as a story, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So let's talk about choosing a question. As with any dissertation, choosing the question is probably the most important task that's facing you, because whatever question you choose is going to determine everything that follows. Your selection of relevant literature, the selection of the parts of your experience that you choose to highlight in the dissertation, the question determines everything. So Robert Nash says that a good question displays three elements. First of all, it focuses on a dynamic, a social change dynamic, where you as a leader, and I'm talking particularly to those in the field of leadership, where you as a leader are struggling to understand something that has been a permanent feature of your life over several years. So this is not a one-off event. It's something that you've really struggled with, tried to understand, tried to make sense of over a long period of time, because you'll need all the data of those experiences to draw on. But at its center, a question is some change dynamic. How do I address resistance, as in Laura Love's dissertation? How do I build authentic relationships, as in Sandra Unger's dissertation? It could be, how do I develop a cohesive team that's based on real trust and collaboration? So whatever the dynamic that you choose it somehow should relate to social change. Secondly, and I've already said this, so I'll just recap this briefly, the question that you choose determines all your subsequent choices. So the way in which you decide this literature is relevant but that literature isn't, or the way that you say I want this event or this experience in my dissertation but that one doesn't really pertain to what I'm looking at, that's going to be determined by your question. So pretty much every decision you make as a researcher comes down to asking yourself, does this help me answer the question? Does it help the reader see how the question is being answered? And then, as I say, the third element of this that Robert Nash in particular emphasizes is that the theme, the topic, the dynamic that you're looking at should somehow be transformative. In other words, it should be a dynamic that has the potential, if you understand properly what's going on, it has the potential to transform an organization or a community or a department or a school or a unit or an institution, whatever. So Nash says, try and identify at the heart of your question some kind of transformative change that will happen as a result of the question being addressed in a dissertation. I'm going to talk now about the nuts and bolts of how you write a proposal, a dissertation proposal, using the SPN framework. And in exploring this, a very helpful book that Robert Nash and DeMethra, Lashar, Bradley wrote is called Me-Search and Research, a guide to writing scholarly personal manuscripts. Nash and Bradley have a nice fourfold framework in that book for how to go about doing an SPN. And I'm going to spend some time going through that because my own students in the past have found it very helpful. So they say an SPN comprises 4 phases: the pre-search, the me-search, the re-search, and the we-search. Those 4 sound very similar, so let me just repeat them again. It's pre, me, re, and we. Okay? Pre-search, me-search, research, and we-search. The pre-search, which is the beginning phase of an SPN study, is that phase when you're trying to decide exactly what your question will be, when you're trying to hone in on a dynamic that you've been trying to understand for several years, you've had a lot of experience trying to work through, you've explored different avenues of how to respond to the dynamic. So the pre-search is essentially the statement of the question. A typical dissertation starts off with a statement of the question, and that's the pre-search. The me-search is where you decide these aspects of my own experience are ones that are relevant to the question, and these other aspects are less pertinent. So in the me-search, you're really deciding on your data. You're trying to identify what data you need to collect in order to answer the question effectively. So this is sort of like the description of methodology chapter that would happen in a dissertation. You begin by just outlining what the SPN methodology is, and then you say, according to this methodology, this is the data that I think needs to be collected, analyzed and examined, reported out, as it were, in order to write an effective dissertation that answers the question. So the me search is like the description of methodology chapter. The literature review corresponds to the research part of an SPN. So in the research phase, you're subjecting the data that you've collected to analysis through the lens of relevant literature, theory, and scholarship. So I guess that's the closest to a sort of literature review chapter, because in the proposal you're saying, in order for me to do a scholarly personal narrative, I need to subject my experiences to rigorous commentary and comparison and analysis through relevant lenses of literature, and here are the ones I'm going to be looking at. So that's where you lay out, here's what I'm going to explore out there in scholarship in order for me to make sense of my data. And then the we search, the final phase of an SPN proposal, is where you say, here are some of the implications that I hope to be able to offer to readers from having done an analysis of my data. So I'm hoping to be able to help people understand the dynamics of resistance to change, to help readers understand why transformation usually engenders a lot of pushback and anger. I'm going to show you how to negotiate the dynamics of anger, to generate interest when apathy or skepticism or mistrust is present, and so on and so forth. So you try and say, well, from this analysis of my own personal narrative, here are some of the implications for the wider practice of leadership, the doing of leadership that I hope to be able to lay out. So in this section, I want to look at some of the frequently asked questions that I get about this particular methodology. The first one is, do I need to interview other people? So although this is a personal analysis of your experience, one way you make sense of experience always is talking it over with other people. So I often get asked, if I'm describing a set of events that I went through with other people involved, do I need to go and interview those other people? Short answer is no, you don't need to go and interview them. However, if you want to chat to them, if you want to talk to them, you're quite free to do that, because talking to people is a major part of personal experience, right? That's how we get through the day, is by talking to people and comparing what's happening to us and asking them questions of, well, what do you think about this? So you're absolutely allowed to draw on multiple chats, conversations, exchanges, interactions that you've had with people over the years. And, if it would be helpful to you to set up a couple of meetings in coffee shops or in the cafeteria with people, and you just want to check your memory of events, that's absolutely fine. But you don't have to set up a formal interview and transcribe or tape those interviews and do all the kind of things you do in an interview-based methodology, because ultimately the data is your own personal experience and the way you interpret that personal experience. And if the way that you interpret your experience is going to be helped by talking things over, well, that's fine. But ultimately, the data is your own personal experience. Secondly, do you need IRB approval? At my own university, the University of St. Thomas, where I worked with this method, the answer was no. You don't need to get IRB approval, and that was met with a sigh of relief by anyone who was choosing to use this dissertation methodology. Because again, the data that's being examined is not data collected from others data is data collected from yourself, from your own experience. So no IRB was necessary, at least when I worked at the University of St. Thomas. Thirdly, what are the chief problems about writing an SPN? I often get asked by people as they're thinking about it, well, I don't really know this methodology. What would you say are the things I need to watch out for? So let me just talk about a few of those. Number one, you have to be able to write well. So you have to have some creative ability. You need to be able to do good creative fiction writing. So if you're much more comfortable with just doing interviews, presenting the findings, coding themes, generating categories, and just reporting out 10 people said this, 7 people said that, this really isn't a dissertation for you. If that's what you're comfortable with doing, then stick to doing that kind of more traditional case study. Because an SPN is a narrative, it's a story, it's an arc, it requires some creative flourishes, the use of metaphors and allusions. You need to draw the reader in to your story to find ways of connecting to them and so on. You need to have a good turn of phrase. So that's one thing you need to be aware of that's a potential problem for a lot of writers. I've seen students say, oh, an SPN, I've just got to talk about what happened to me. That's great, I'll choose that. And it seems like an easy option. But when I get an early draft of how they want to do a proposal, particularly the things they're going to include as significant pieces of data, and they write about those in very flat ways, I say you really shouldn't be doing an SPN, because you need to have a much more literary flourish in the way you're writing this. Second, if you're the kind of student who wants to say, here's my plan, I'm going to interview these people, I'm going to look for these predetermined themes, then this is not a dissertation for you, because inevitably in an SPN study, you'll start dredging up your experiences, you'll start exploring them through the lens of your own thinking and reflection, but also through the lens of all the scholarly literature and research and theory. And what always happens is that new directions start popping up, new ideas occur to you. You start thinking about a set of events that you neatly explained in your own mind, and you realize, actually, there's a completely different perspective that I could bring to bear on this. So as you get into the actual writing of the study, the nuts and bolts of the documentation of experience, this is going to go in a lot of very different directions. So for some, that'll be great, creatively energizing, liberating. For others, it'll drive you crazy, because you'll be thinking, well, when the hell is this going to end? Now I've got this theme, now I've got that theme. So like I say, if you want a dissertation that's neatly bounded, where you've got a predetermined set of questions and you stick to exploring those, then an SPN is not really the kind of study you should be considering. Thirdly, I should warn you that in an SPN, the advisor's function, your supervisor, your chair, however you describe that person, the person who's sponsoring the research for you and is guiding you along the way, that person is constantly going to be in your ear, challenging you. So one of my functions as an advisor was to read a student's interpretation of a set of experiences and then to say, hang on, I think there's another very radically different way of interpreting this. You need to go and read this person over here, or you need to explore this theoretical framework, or you need to look at what you're reporting through this conceptual lens. So I would constantly be putting inconvenient roadblocks in people's paths, because the scholarly part of a scholarly personal narrative is that you constantly are re-explaining and reinterpreting your narrative experiences through the lens of external literature. And since your supervisor should know a lot about the literature in whatever area she or he is supervising you, you have to rely on them to bring this inconvenient literature to you and to say to you, all right, in light of this, what now do you think about how you've explained this episode or this incident or this set of experiences? So you have to know that when you get into an SPN, you're constantly going to be challenged by your advisor to look at new literature, new research, new theory, and respond to it. And for some people, that's just way too onerous and annoying and irritating. So I just wanted to let you know that may be in your future. Finally, I often get asked, what's the difference between an SPN and life history? Well, a life history usually is a life history. You're reviewing the whole arc of your life's experience, and you're tracing something that began in childhood and adolescence, continued through young adulthood into middle age and maturity. An SPN is not like that. You're just focusing on whatever set of experiences speak to the dynamic that your question has identified. So you won't be telling the whole story of your life. You'll only be telling the story of very particular events and experiences that pertain to the question you're examining. So it's not a life history at all. I think the closest method it comes to is an autoethnography. I think there's a lot of crossover between those. But an autoethnography is not set up in the way that an SPN, an autoethnography dissertation, typically has a more traditional literature review, and then you just tell the story. And then you do some analysis. Whereas an SPN, yes, you can begin with saying, this is the literature that I think is going to pertain to my story, but really, as you tell the story, you're constantly weaving in and out of scholarly literature, personal experience, a theory, a set of events that's explained by that theory, a concept, and then an analysis of experience that concept challenges or illuminates. So unlike an autoethnography, an SPN constantly goes back and forth as you're writing it between experience, literature, experience, scholarship. Finally, let me tell you about a few resources that you might find helpful in following up on these remarks of mine. The first is Robert Nash's book, Liberating Scholarly Writing, which came out in 2004. This really began the whole wave of work and activity around SPN. So that's really the founding of this particular methodology, where Nash lays out exactly what an SPN is, argues the case for why it's an important addition to scholarly modes of research and so on. Then you have a series of books that he has written with collaborators to expand on this methodology. The book Me Search and Research, mentioned a couple of times, with DeMethra, LaShaw, Bradley, that came out in 2011. That's probably the most specific nuts and bolts description of how to write an SPN study. So I often use that as a required book in courses where we're examining SPN methodology. Then Robert Nash has written some very helpful books with Sidnee Viray at the University of Vermont, where they've looked at the application of SPN methodology to some real life contexts. In 2013, they wrote a book called Our Stories Matter. In 2014, the two of them wrote a book called How Stories Heal. I also wanted to mention an article that is a nice shorthand summary of an SPN methodology. This is by Unger and Carney, and Ing is spelt N-G, but pronounced Ing. So Ing and Carney wrote a piece called Scholarly Personal Narrative in the SoTL Tent. Scholarly Personal Narrative in the SoTL Tent. SoTL, by the way, refers to scholarship of teaching and learning. And this particular article is published in a journal called Teaching and Learning Inquiry. It's volume 5, number 1. So if you Google that, you can find it, a nice PDF of it on the web. Finally, let me mention 2 dissertations of mine that I think were, that I supervised, that are nice examples of the SPN methodology. The first I've mentioned already is by Sandra, Unger, Unger, published in 2014. Full title is We Shouldn't Even Know Each Other. We Shouldn't Even Know Each Other, a scholarly personal narrative of the development of deeply reciprocal relationships across differences of race and class. If you Google that, there is a very nice PDF of the whole dissertation that you'll be taken to online. The second dissertation is by Laura Love. It was published in 2018 at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. The title is Journey Toward Racial Justice in Schools, a scholarly personal narrative on exposing racial injustice and sustaining the fight for equity in mostly white schools. That concludes my summary of what exactly the SPN methodology is all about, how you might go about preparing a dissertation proposal using an SPN format, some questions that are often raised about SPNs, and a quick signposting of a few resources if you want to follow this up. I hope this has been helpful, and good luck if you do choose to write an SPN. I can guarantee you, if you do, many more people will read this than they will read a traditional qualitative case study. By the way, if you're interested in following up on this SPN, I did want to let you know that this particular video can be found on my website. The URL is just stephenbrookfield.com. So that's my name, all in lowercase, stephenbrookfield.com. The Stephen has a PH in it. Again, stephenbrookfield.com. Just go to stephenbrookfield.com and you'll find this video plus multiple other resources on there for you. I put up all the classroom activities I use. I put up descriptions of exercises I like to adopt. I put up writings that I've recently written. Basically everything that I'm involved in, I try and make available for free download. This is a free access website. You don't need to ask my permission to use anything that you find on my website. I basically learn as a practitioner by stealing from my colleagues. So I see someone doing something, or I read about an activity that someone has tried, and I think, wow, I can use that in my own class or my own professional development or in the meetings that I'm running or whatever. So I've learned by stealing from people I respect. So I urge you to steal from me. If you publish something based on my work, I'd appreciate an acknowledgement of it, but you don't have to contact me and ask for permission to use anything you find on my website, okay? Just go ahead, be an informed burglar, and plunder my resources. One more time, the URL is stephenbrookfield.com.